Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about where does Mexico stand? How have Trump's machinations changed things? Our guest for the show is Carlos Juarez of the East West Center. Welcome to the show, Carlos.
Welcome, Jay. A real pleasure. Delighted to reconnect. Been quite a while, but really grateful to have a chance to talk a little bit about Mexico. It's buried under all this stuff going on in the world, but such an important neighbor, partner, integral part of our North America, whatever you want to say. And very interesting things happening. In particular, right now, they have a woman president who is, quite well, very relatively popular, and offering a contrast to some of the crazy stuff we've seen in terms of interactions with the Trump administration. She's taking a very cool-headed diplomatic approach. So we'll talk a little bit about her, Claudia Sheinbaum, of course, but otherwise, underscoring, key how important Mexico is for, trade, of course, no doubt. But beyond that, it continues to be the leading source of immigrants and huge population of Mexicans in the U.S. Many that have been there from before it became, many who are obviously, the steady flow. And these days, a lot of changing dynamics. Yes, it's not this massive, hordes of crisis. Years ago, I remember you and I talking, watching those caravans literally 10 years ago when I was in Europe at the time. Another deep crisis at that time. Today, a lot of bewilderment and puzzling, around the world. I had a chance recently to travel to Europe as well and Mexico, and just tell you that, yeah, a lot of shaking heads and increasingly a lot of people not wanting to come and kind of ride it out and wait and see what happens. People that might otherwise regularly come, including good friends and relatives. Anyhow, let me stop on that. And again, for you, I'm grateful for this opportunity. From Hawaii, we forget, but Mexico, literally, if we had a direct flight to Mexico City, it would be the closest foreign capital. We get there in like 5.5 hours. It's literally just straight across. But nevertheless, also buried under our own local culture, it's, Latinos, Hispanics are the fastest growing ethnic group, but we're outnumbered by Filipinos. We don't have the same quite status as the Portuguese, even though we've been here since literally King Kamehameha III brought those first cowboys from Alta California. But let me turn to you, Jay. Grateful for this opportunity again to share some updates on Mexico, a Pacific country also that we need to remind ourselves, a neighbor right across the west. I'm sorry, the east side for us. Their Western Pacific. Yes.
Yeah, so important. Mexico is an important economic, strategic neighbor, trading partner. We really do need to follow what is going on and what Trump is doing in his moves against Mexico and what countermeasures Claudia Sheinbaum is taking in response. But let me ask you about some immediate things. There are floods in Mexico City. How serious is that? And is that a regular thing? Is that climate change? What is that?
It's not a regular thing, although water is a very, very, I guess, key issue, both a challenge for Mexico City because it's this megalopolis way up high in the mountains, a mile high, surrounded by mountains. So it's got a whole bunch of geographic challenges. Let me tell you quickly, I've been so busy literally in the last hours, I have not followed up to tell you I know what's happening on that, but I will say it's not common to have floods. Now, it also offers us an interesting opportunity because Mexico City is a challenging megalopolis, but it also has interesting you could say models and stories that it has been able to share and learn from others in rapid transit and managing things. And in fact, getting back to Claudia Sheinbaum, the current president, she was elected October of last year to become president, but her background is really Mexico City. She used to be the mayor there from, gosh, I want to say from about 2018 to 20, gosh, if I'm recalling, it was the time that I was actually there, 2018 to 23. I was living in Mexico much of that time and got to see her firsthand. But all this to say too that there's a pretty well established, sort of rapid response system, disaster management. Mexico is a major earthquake place, and so they've had, even in the time I was there, some pretty serious ones. Well, that aside, I would just say, back to her. In addition to her and the story, we want to talk a little bit about. There's also a very important dynamic happening in Mexico politically that is also going under the radar, and it was a significant reform of the judicial system, the judiciary. This last weekend, Mexico literally became like the first country, say, to elect all the judges. I mean, it's an astonishing issue. It raises a lot of concerns for some observers, in particular, that it may lead to potentially more corruption, even though the rationale was to root Mexico of this. So again, this judicial election has interesting implications for the relationship with the U.S. as well, and what it might mean. Of course, Mexico is a as well. It's a relatively recent new democracy, kind of evolving, and you have with this new president, she is succeeding the predecessor, Andres Lopez Manuel. I'm sorry, Lopez Obrador, and he, of course, kind of came and broke the system. Came in with a sort of a very personalistic, rather even rather authoritarian, but also deeply democratic, because extremely popular and kind of a populist. Some would say a demagogue, etc. He's now gone, and she has replaced him. She was his successor. But what I'm really getting at is that they have essentially a new political party, a new movement that today now essentially has captured and co-ops and controls the Mexican political system in ways, curiously, that the old PRI, if you have memories of Mexico, used to be the perfect dictatorship. It was a one-party state for about 70 years until, finally the 80s or 90s, and when it transition. Well, this new movement, this party that is now she's a part of, is now effectively been able to not break, to take pretty strong control over the judiciary in ways that are seen as worrisome. So there's that. And again, it's part of her legacy as well because she pushed it through, uh, even in spite of a lot of criticism, particularly from outside and from judicial experts saying this has got a lot of risk and for different reasons. Yeah.
Well, you'd think that people would get behind her because, because of what Trump is doing and how she needs to respond, and and she's likable, she's strong, all the right things. But what I don't understand is why the cartels have gotten so violent in the last few days.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is a photo of her, and I'll come back to your question in a moment, but just to maybe bring some quick context, I mean, this is Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo. She's the president of Mexico, the 66th president now, and she made records for a number of things. Of course, the first female president, and no doubt a very symbolic move for Mexico, a growing role for gender equality and the like. She's also curiously, unlike AMLO, her predecessor, this more populist kind of demagogue. She's a very accomplished, a scientist herself. Her background is, she's a politician today, but she's an academic. Indeed, came out of the field of sort of engineering, environmental engineering. But she's gone on to, to be incredibly popular, and today even more. And for example, you mentioned the question of Trump, and let me show. I think I've got another photo if I can find it here. This was a picture on the day a few weeks back when there was a big showdown over the tariffs. And at the very last minute, as you know, Trump on and on, off again. Suddenly he brought Mexico to the brink, and then he pulled back, and so it was for her a victory. And rather than kind of thumb them in the nose or be she used it as an opportunity to kind of rally again support for her taking a pretty stern position, but essentially cool headed, a very diplomatic approach in response to Trump, and it's given her continued strength in a way that is quite remarkable. I mean, the world is watching this and seeing her as doing quite well. Here's another photo of her again. Very curious because her background, she represents an immigrant to Mexico from Eastern Europe, and of Jewish heritage. So first woman, first Jewish. And child of immigrants. In the case of her, let me recall, her father has immigrants from Lithuania, and then the mother from Bulgaria, and they're both pretty accomplished. Her mother became a pretty significant. Or actually, her mother was a daughter of an immigrant. Went on to become a really top biologist in Mexico at the university. Established a biochemistry research lab. So very interesting background. And now she's got a style that is again is a very kind of cool-headed, very calm and persistent, pushing back when you need to, but not, knowing how to balance. Now, also being very careful, she has not made a visit to Washington since becoming president. Traditionally, the new Mexican president, their first visit is Washington or maybe Ottawa. She's kept a kind of low profile in light of the Trump right now chaos and watching others come. So there are teams of Mexican, negotiators, particularly over recent, economic issues that scramble back and forth. A lot of that goes on, but at the highest level, I think she's taken a very prudent approach to kind of wait back and let it all play out. And, if she doesn't have to see him, probably better yet. So there you have. It's a very interesting, dynamic. I think if I've got maybe one more, let me just double check one more quick photo to share of her. Oh yeah, here, and this is a recent, the recent judicial reform that took place. It had a lot of acrimony and tension, and maybe let me just get back to describe that in a little more detail, because for the U.S. it's a situation that should be of more than just academic concern. It's interesting. No other real country in the modern era of democracy has put all the elected officials out for vote, including the Supreme Court, and in ways that, oh my gosh, to qualify. It's not like it goes through the rigorous, review. You literally need just a degree, a couple of recommendation letters, and boom, you're on the ballot. And anyhow, given that we have this very complex partnership, you have other issues that this could affect, including the USMCA agreement, the NAFTA 2.0. We have interests, of course, not just in trade, but migration, issues related to organized crime and national security. That's, the main agenda. But the problem with this reform, the way many will see it, is that now it has kind of essentially politicized it, and many are seeing the likelihood it could be captured by criminal organizations, the cartels themselves, and not, that's one part. The other is it has given this party in control now pretty much the ability, like we've seen in some other authoritarian regimes, to completely bring to its knees the judiciary, and the Supreme Court is now vastly overwhelmingly the ruling parties. They have all the ability to control the process, the election. So it creates a little bit of concern, and that it's legitimacy. The outcome of the election, I think 13.13% participated. The presidential election was 60 plus, and so it erodes some of the legitimacy of it. So there's a lot of concern that moving forward, and yet there's another story that's very exciting. The very first indigenous judge is going to be on the Supreme Court, who got elected, and so you have these great stories on one hand, and yet concern that now you're going to have a lot of fairly unskilled and less competent sort of judiciary of the people. It hasn't worked well in many other places. One of the few countries they've done it in recent years is Bolivia, and doesn't show good results. In general, the judiciary should be independent for a reason, somewhat depoliticized. And even though here in the US we have at the local level elections that take place in some states, you don't popularly elect the Supreme Court, you don't popularly elect the federal judiciary. They have to go through a pretty rigorous process ensuring, that they're qualified, I guess, and experienced, et cetera. Well, Mexico will be in to see what will play out in these coming months and years. And while, again, it just happened, the results may not be immediate, but there's expectation that you're likely to see, much like you might say even with the US government, if you have people put in not on the basis of their competencies or skills, you're going to see some bumps and errors and mistakes.
You spent a lot of time in Europe, Carlos, under various Fulbright scholarships. And so you must be familiar with the way people reacted to Angela Merkel. Can you compare? It really sounds very similar. Can you compare
Yeah.
Angela Merkel with Claudia Sheinbaum?
It's very interesting. I had not thought of that, but as there are definitely, in terms of their own, I think of Angela and her famous little stand that she would just have this, almost a demeanor of confidence and power. My quick first takeaway is that I see Angela Merkel as like a consensus builder, and she was a world leader, bringing together, and having this ability to bridge them. Scheinbaum is a bit not, she's not taking on that role. She could, but she doesn't. She doesn't see herself in that way. Even at the regional level, she is the natural leader of, the Central Americans, of Latin America. I mean, Mexico is, after all, the largest Spanish speaking, and after Brazil, the second largest country. But curiously, AMLO really, pushed Mexico kind of inward in many ways, the predecessor, and she hasn't quite broken out for various reasons. However, I would say this: given all the challenges and complexities with U.S. relations, Mexico has very much further strengthened their ties with Latin America and with Europe. Continuing, they've always been there, but there's more reason, and very important with Canada. There's always been a very important, very friendly relationship, and even into this trilateral NAFTA and now USMCA agreement, Mexico and the Canada have been able to sometimes push the U.S. and bargain more. But these days, given the U.S. administration, it's a lot more bilateral focus. And curiously, the Mexican president has gotten some praise from Trump. She's not on his radar at the front, but a few times he's commented about how she's a good leader, da da da. So I think she's very much helpful that she's not at the front burner of hot issues. But inevitably they will be there, and we will have these issues. The border will come back. The immigration reform debates, etc. And we're even seeing in the latest examples of where apparently some people being deported. It turns out they were mistaken, and what to do there. And it'll be interesting to see how much cooperation she does offer Trump. At times they have, and even AMLO was brought to his knees through the tariffs and had to deliver. Tighten the southern border. Do more about the what has not returned in the same way is there was this sort of policy of accepting all the third nation people and kind of while they're waiting to be processed in the border, and that created a bunch of confusion. That's off now. And so Mexico is kind of trying to take a rather hard nationalist line, look out for its interests, and even in light of the Trump tariff stuff, pushing its own made in Mexico, develop its own sort of national, you could say, yeah, emphasize more its own national made goods. The bottom line, however, at the end of the day, is that Mexico and the U.S. and Canada, they're all deeply intertwined and interconnected in terms of the economies I'm speaking, and culture too. But the economies, and it's led by the automotive sector, where you can't just put a tariff and put a wall because we've got parts flowing back and forth, and components from everywhere. That it's not a nice, neat world where you can just shut it at the border, and we all lose at the end of the day. So it's interesting to see how they're trying to manage this, but I will, certainly remind us that she continues to have very, very high levels of support. Her approach, her strategy. However, the reality is that Mexico stands to lose in some of this, and the economy, if it does suffer, it's never easy to keep pleasing everybody, and no politician stays popular forever. Eventually, the results are not there. So it'll be interesting to see. She's still in a relative honeymoon since October, and I think in some ways the Trump pressure has allowed her to maintain popularity and to be seen as a pretty effective leader.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts come to mind, Carlos. Where you say that Angela Merkel saw herself as a world leader. Don't you think that Latin America needs a Latin American leader? And really, the best, most stable, most appealing, most popular, um, national leader in Latin America is Claudia Sheinbaum. So if she wanted to, she could really do some stuff in bringing Latin America together. I know it's early for that. Maybe later. What does she have, a 6-year term? Yeah.
It's
Um,
still pretty early on. I agree with you. She has that potential. And I would just add to this. I mean, Latin America, we have to see is not, and I mean by that South America, it's not so easily divided like the left and the right. And while she is a politician from the left, you could say, and in South America, you have a variation. You have some that she will not, get along with the El Salvadoran leader, this, famous dictator. There are others in South America similarly that have those issues. But bottom line is Mexico, at least at the especially beyond just economic. I mean, its sheer size and power and popular culture in many ways, like the U.S. is for the world, Mexico is for Latin America, for the Spanish-speaking world. So it's a natural leader, and yet it hasn't always use that that soft power. She can and could do that, and I think she represents many things. She's got strong support for indigenous causes, for environmental issues, for gender issues, which is pretty widespread in Latin America. There's a strong consensus these days, at least in those that have it. And lastly, she's one of these stories, a very interesting immigrant, and you see it in some other countries too. Some other women leaders and children and grandchildren of immigrants. And today she represents this very interesting, these Ashkenazi Jews who emigrated, right? One came in 1940, right? I think it was from Bulgaria. As soon as the Soviet Union occupied, they initially went to what was then Palestine for 2 years and then came to Mexico. And people, we often have maybe a misperception of Mexico being just brown and white, and there are white elites, but those whites come from everywhere, and it's not only Spain, the mother country. You have a lot of Eastern Europeans. You have some from other parts of Latin America. You even have Spanish who've emigrated back, let's say Civil War and other times. So there's a lot of interesting communities, and while it's a small community, it's a very, very long-standing and well-established Jewish community in Mexico City primarily, but also some of the other urban areas. But they've always been leaders in different areas, in academia, in the media, in the arts, and she has kind of, it symbolizes this diverse complexity of Mexico's culture. And, as a young girl, she grew up playing, traditional Mexican ballads and things. So she's got credibility in a way. She's not a fresh off the boat immigrant. She grew up as a Mexican, and so very interesting to see that. I have an interesting affinity, both because I got to know her there while I was there. And before then, she was like the mayor of Mexico City, as I mentioned, and she's an academic, happened to be born the same year as me. So there's just this sense of I've seen her come through. And I would add that in her academic world, she studied some time at the University of California, Berkeley. She has a doctorate from Mexico City's UNAM, but she was also part of the team that basically won this award for the climate change, the Nobel Peace Prize, part of this large consortium of climate scientists. So there's that, and you can't help but get excited. But like every politician, you have to be real. She's going up against a very, very large number of vested interests, powerful players and actors. She doesn't control parts of the state. There are areas where obviously organized crime is in control, and interesting to see now. There's been a little bit of cooperation with the U.S. on allowing some surveillance, use of drones, for example. But we've also heard a lot, and we know there are people in the Trump administration pushing for a military involvement, which is a very, very, very sensitive issue. If that happens, I mean, it'll make Mexico, I think, go pretty, and the world, I think, but especially Mexico and Latin America, that would be a real mistake if the U.S. were to do something very blatantly. Now, there are other ways they do it subtly, and yeah, I mean, we know it happens. But let me say that whereas we have a history of 30, 40 years now of cooperation on the drug issues, since AMLO came in, he kicked out the DEA and hasn't been cooperating very well. So lately, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, uh, the U.S. has been kind of just looking at it from the outside, you could say. That might change also.
Carlos, let's go back to you know the the tariffs. What's the status of the tariff practice that Trump is doing to Mexico? What countermeasures has Claudia come up with? Are they working? What's the nature of the relationship? And with what other countries is Mexico now focusing on for its trade? So, what changes have come about because of the tariff impositions?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things quickly. And let me say, while there are efforts to kind of diversify and look elsewhere, at the end of the day, geography and the world economy is going to make the US and Mexico and Canada always deeply integrated. That's not going to change. And yet, because of this, we are seeing that, oh, can we go? But Mexico's never going to replace the U.S. in the way that it is, and vice versa, I would say. But first, I would go back to this. I think her response so far has been rather cool-headed and more diplomatic in response to the steel and aluminum tariffs, and she's been seeking to protect industries and jobs while also trying to de-escalate the trade dispute. So here are a couple of breakdowns of their responses. One, the retaliatory measures. She has stated that Mexico will implement retaliatory measures on goods if a satisfactory agreement is not reached. So they're still negotiating that. Now, that's her card. She's meeting as we speak now with Mexican steel and aluminum groups to discuss potential countermeasures, but they're keeping their cards held closely. They don't want to put them on the table just yet. Instead, they're emphasizing diplomatic channels and dialogue, but that can only go so far. With the Trump team, it's all transaction. It's about, the deal, let's say. Now, one of the things that I think she's also trying to do, I mentioned Canada, there's a focus on the USMCA. There is a trade agreement that we have. And by Mexico stressing that these tariffs are in violation of that, it's a way of saying, hey, wait a minute, no. There are rules that you signed up. Now, the US, the rules kind of depend, and it's the big, asymmetric power bully that kind of does it regardless. But I go back to that. Mexico is using that as obviously a card to say, wait, no, we've got this MCA. So maybe the way to put it, it's a more targeted response. So they're delaying the details, they're pending, but several potential retaliatory tariffs may focus on things like steel and aluminum rather than a broad, eye for an eye approach. Interestingly, and what I see more of this happening is Mexico, and you see this in a few other partners, are targeting their responses to red states, areas that are going to hurt, that are kind of, very targeted, not just, a broad thing. And Mexico is doing a lot of that. They have a very good understanding of American politics, better than even our current administration, I might say, that they follow it closely. They understand it. And even in terms of like, should the day come when you meet with them, how the praise, all that, the protocol, they know how that goes. And anyhow, the last thing I would say, similarly, curiously to like Trump, what she's taking is an approach of strengthening domestic industry. So bolstering this Made in Mexico campaign, accelerating domestic production to reduce reliance on imports. That's a common strategy, but sometimes it's a lot easier to say that than to actually implement. I think the key points I would say, takeaways, Mexico clearly recognizes the potential economic impact of these external tariffs, and they could bring Mexico down bad. I mean, we hear about the U.S. recession, but Mexico could hurt even more. And it's a different, I guess you could say, socioeconomic structure. Half the people are we would consider pretty poor by our standards. They're going to remain poor. It's that part that kind of is moving forward. That in the last generation has moved up, and then it's the very wealthy who either take their money out or otherwise close down. So they recognize that, and I think that this delay I've described in announcing any specific countermeasures, it just indicates their desire to de-escalate, to explore alternative solutions. She's taking a very diplomatic approach. They hope that they can leverage the very strong relationship with the U.S. Beyond just trade that we have. Just in terms of the border states. The governors and the relations are very very intertwined and complex. And so finally, I think they're also looking to focus beyond the tariffs, which Trump is using this as the little tool. They're focusing or broadening it to focus on the border security and drug trafficking issues, to make sure that the conversation is not just tariff, 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 to address these other concerns. And so that's kind of where you have it. And overall, I would say they're managing it reasonably well. They're fortunate that they're not like on the front burner, like this Canada got singled out, and then it's like the EU suddenly is and then they're put on hold. But a lot of bewilderment and frustration about the on again, off again, and how do you handle it, and endless dialogue, as you can imagine, about how to make sense of it. How do you negotiate with that type of very different. And I would also add finally that you've got these leaders and they do impact policy, but at the end of the day, you have so many complex connections between civil society, business, culture, that the U.S. Mexico relationship, is going to continue, and it's there, but it's right now in a very messy, complicated moment of uncertainty, like so many things.
What about oil? And what about exports from Mexico? Canada is selling resources and it's selling manufactured product to countries other than the US. The Canadians are not coming to the US. They treat the US as a pariah, many of them, and they'd rather do business with Asia or Europe. Is that same phenomenon happening in Mexico?
Not quite in the same way. And let me say, for example, Mexico does continue to producing oil. It's not on the scale that the U.S. is simply blowing them away. And increasingly, a lot of Mexico's oil has to come to the U.S. to get refined. They don't have the capacity. Interestingly, one of the big, big major works of the outgoing last president, Lopez Obrador, he basically created a new refinery in southern Mexico. But many see it as not a forward thinking, kind of like it's a policy of the past, and more dependence on that. At the end of the day, Mexico is it's got this mixed bonanza on one hand, but also an albatross. The oil is a mixed blessing. It's been a source of a lot of corruption. It's not the most efficiently run, oil industry in the world, and the U.S. is kind of it has a lot more advantages, has a lot more of this newer, whatever we call it, the shale and the stuff. But particularly when it comes to the refining, whether it's the Canadian or the Mexican type, Mexico doesn't have that capacity. So again, and at the end of the day, the Mexican oil company still nationalized. It liberalized a little bit, but then now it's kind of pulled back, and so it's tremendously politicized. It's extremely in debt. So it's just the oil company Pemex. They haven't been able to invest to bring it up to speed. And while they did open for foreign investment, and it is happening for exploration, um, the recent past has also, and even this judicial reform I've described, has sent a lot of mixed signals, because you get pulled more by political whims rather than what do businesses want: certainty, rules, things that they can predict. And the judicial reform really does have that potential to see a lot of mishaps, and just kind of jerk reactions rather than cool heads prevailing in that area. So yeah, the oil is still an important sector for Mexico, but many critical that instead of seeing the potential for maybe more green technologies, they've stayed with this rather antiquated model, and the push of creating this new refinery in the home state and hometown of the former president was just a jobs creation thing built by the military, not even like oil companies, let's say, that know how to do it. So it's part of his legacy. Yeah, let me close on that, I guess, about the oil, but it's still a very important part. And even issues of the energy grids at the border, Texas and the US. And we know Texas has had its problems, and there's been some issues where they've had some energy cutoffs in northern Mexico affecting Texas again to show how interdependent we are. And those are a result of climate change because we have more severe weather in northern Mexico, this desert area, very, very intense.
The border, you mentioned the border. We should spend a little time on the border. Homeland Security and the Border Patrol, they're tightening the border. They're making it hard to cross from Mexico into the U.S. And for that matter, they're using the border as a way to catch people. And in fact, the army is occupying a zone just north of the border. So it's dangerous for a lot of people, undocumented people in the U.S., to try to go south to Mexico. So I wonder, what's the demographic on that? Are Mexican people trying to get back to Mexico? Are Mexican people who are undocumented trying to get back to Mexico? Are people in Mexico still interested in coming to the U.S.? Are they applying for whatever visa would be appropriate? And here's one that you're going to have some trouble with. Are Americans trying to get to Mexico the same way they're trying to get to Canada, to avoid the loss of civil liberties and to avoid, being arrested and detained by Homeland Security? So, what's the border like these days?
No, there are a lot of different things to quickly touch on briefly. On one hand, there still is a flow both ways, but more particularly, what I would say first is we don't have a crisis on the way that sometimes the media pulls out, like we've seen in the past, where literally we had caravans and okay, that's not quite there. But a couple of thoughts first. From the U.S. side, we do have a lot of new players involved, the military that you mentioned, and there are certain roles they can do: set up a tent, do this. But when it comes to immigration, there are certain things that they're not as trained to do. It's more either a combination of law enforcement and also just even humanitarian. But a lot of it is more for show and to have the idea is you can just have more numbers, more people, but eventually you're just creating work for them. What can they do? Da, da, da. Now, from Mexico's side, again, I would say there's always a steady flow because at the end of the day, there's a labor market that's in demand, and there are people who simply, no matter what you do, if you don't have a lot of skills in Mexico, you can make 20 times more by getting over that border, however hard it is. And those networks still exist. Now, it is a little more risky nowadays and dangerous. And what you described is only going to show more. It's going to be harder, no doubt. And that's part of this plan, try to tighten it up. What I want to say that's probably different today, especially in these last 5 years, is the diversity. We have a lot of immigrants now, not just Mexico, but literally Central America, South America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia. So that you've got again Chinese, Haitians, literally from West Africa showing up in Tijuana, showing up in Ciudad Juarez, in significant numbers now. Venezuelans, Central America, and that wasn't the case certainly 10 years ago. So there's that challenge now within Mexico too. Even when you had that wave of those caravans, it started to strike a chord, and a lot of people. You see a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment as well, especially among more middle class and wealthy elites, and discrimination. These are people coming; they talk different. They're from Central America. They're from South, and so there's definitely an element of that. And Mexico has its share of racism, of anti yeah, anti-immigrant sentiment, if you will. But I think the other thing I would say, like the legal process, it's always there, but it's so slow, so complex. Interestingly, the U.S. Embassy has just opened a brand new, large, massive embassy in Mexico City, and it's in part to help. What is always a you might imagine in Mexico City, the one of the largest embassies at one time, bigger than Russia. I don't know these days if it is, but in terms of how many people work there in process every day, thousands and thousands of people in line to go through, get visas, come and travel, etc. let me set that aside and say, having just traveled again recently, there's definitely, and even in Europe, where I was back in April, in light of this current thing, happening with the U.S. and rather harsh, a lot of anti-American and anti-Trump. I think the more nuanced people can distinguish it, but for some, it's just it's the ugly American in its worst manifestation. So people reluctant to want to travel as much, changing their plans, holding off, and again, people I know who normally do come and go, and might potentially visit me, but rarely do. Of course, everybody says they want to come to Hawaii, but they don't. But the real point is now the U.S. is suddenly among foreigners a place to reconsider, and see what happens. But also, even more than that, among Americans and ethnic Americans traveling, I don't feel it myself. I feel reasonably confident, but I have friends and colleagues who might be traveling and have all your paperwork in order, but concerned. Are you going to have a bad day with this TSA agent or somebody that's been given orders to da da da? So the climate is there. Set that aside, I mean, obviously, I'm part of the higher education, international exchange, and all that. And these are tough times for us. We're making do, we're managing, but it's definitely a climate of that we've not seen before of everything and what continues the ongoing stuff with the attacks on international students at Harvard and the like. I mean, we're all living that here as well.
Back when, it was kind of a surprise to find that a lot of Latinos living in this country, including Latinos that had, permanent resident visas or were citizens, were sympathetic to Trump, even though Trump was obviously at war with Latin America and Latin and Latinos. Is that still the same? Has that changed in any way? What would you say about Latinos living and Mexicans living in the U.S. under one form of immigrant status or another, who support Trump, who support MAGA, who support the Republican Party, or has that changed?
Well, I mean, we did see in the last election for Trump that it did change in that he got a significant amount of support in places in the South Rio Grande Valley of Texas, areas of Cuba, I mean, I'm sure Cuban Americans in South Florida that you might expect. But the surprise really came in Mexicans in Texas, and long, not new immigrant arrivals, long established part of the communities there. And I don't have the full answer, but some of it has more to do with look, people that are just with the same similar frustrations and grievance, maybe more cultural, maybe or not, I might say something, not the most informed, about nuances of U.S. relations with Latin America. No, it's more like this is a guy that looks like he'll get things done, and the other one doesn't look like it, and pretty. Or there's and let me add this: I was able to see, and let me share this an interesting anecdote in Mexico, talking with some cousins that I have there. I was visiting Tampico, south of the Mexico border, and different times it's had a lot of violence, and even today still has basically organized violence, that come around and collect protection money, for example. And what they were sharing with me is like, hey, they wouldn't mind if someone came in here and basically, put a pretty heavy hand on these criminals. In other words, there is support for some, especially more, I would say the more entrepreneurial middle class, but not just them, and people who are frustrated because you have a lot of impunity, a lot of violence with nothing ever getting done, disappearances. The judiciary, the reason it got reformed is because it's corrupt. Unfortunately, the reform is not going to fix it. It's going to just have a different institutionalized form of corruption now. But that aside, I mean, yeah, you'll have, let's say, so back to this main point. I think people are just incredibly, I don't know, you're on edge a little bit. It's frustrating and uncertain. Let me stop on that.
Yeah, I would like to get a handle on whether Americans are leaving or want to leave America and settle in other places. And I have several friends and associates who are trying to get to Canada, and some of them have gotten there, trying to get to Europe or Asia and make a life outside of the U.S. because they're afraid of the attacks on the Constitution and the rule of law and so forth. Is anybody, to what extent are Americans trying to get to Mexico and make a new life in Mexico? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, like, first I would say I don't know that there's been a big move of more. but you well know, and there's a long established large community of Americans living there. The numbers are big. I mean, over a million, and many of them concentrated in a few areas. San Miguel de Allende, the sort of central colonial town, has got so many Americans living there. And in general, it offers the attraction of a lower cost of living and the weather, etc. But it's not all paradise. I mean, there are challenges. If you're older and you need health care, yes, they have it. There's good, but it's not always immediately accessible, what have you. So, having said that, I mean, I guess I would say, I'm not aware of like some recent upsurge or wave of people heading to Mexico. I think it's always been there for some, the adventurous ones who know it. A lot of Canadians as well, in fact, and they're sort of what do they call me snowbirds. They spend the winters in Mexico and have a comfortable opportunity. What I will say is this: Mexico City specifically is today a really big global hub of more the professional, and some Americans and other Mexicans who might otherwise be living in Europe or the US coming back, a lot of South Americans. And it's a place where you can have a pretty good quality of life at a relatively low cost compared to, let's say the first world. And you've got all the high tech things and, everything you need, let's say. So there's even in the times I go back and forth, I've seen this really in the last decade. It's become a pretty interesting hub for a lot of that, and it's closely accessible. A couple 2 3 hours, you're in California or Texas or what have you. In a similar way, India, you've got a return of some folks who are suddenly you can be literally at home and have your home cooking and still be connected to your work remote. So I think Mexico is experiencing some of that, but I can say there's been a big push of everybody rushing south, probably more heading to Canada just because it's a little bit more safe and American. And there's still a wide perception in Mexico, and it's real that there are some dangerous places, and you have to know where you're going, preferably, and find the right communities. And they are there's a large diaspora of Americans.
I wonder if you can help me on this too. There was a time when a good part of the current United States was, in fact, under Spain or Mexico. And were it not for the Mexican American War, which was right in the middle of the 19th century, those places would belong to Mexico. And of course, see by the population in this country and by the street names and the names of states and cities and what have you, there's a huge influence from Mexico, huge. And so we're connected culturally, by language, by people who've crossed the border for hundreds of years. So I just wonder, Trump immediately was looking to acquire Greenland. He was looking to acquire the Panama Canal. He was looking to acquire Canada as the 51st state. But I never heard him say that he wanted to acquire Mexico or that he wanted to make Mexico the 51st or possibly the 52nd state. Why?
Too brown, they don't speak the language, and they're not. They're not the. They come from a shithole country. No, of course not. But of course, what you forgot to add was that he did rename the Gulf of Mexico in his name, what the rest of the world has not quite bought onto, the Gulf of Mexico. But it's interesting. I would just say this. I mean, to me, it's always interesting, and I think Trump again reflects that sort of very naivete that somehow it's like almost this manifest destiny attitude. And, in Mexico, every third grader, whether you're in public or private school, learns the history that at one time in this war, which they call the War of North American Aggression, and it was in the mid 19th century. Mexico loses one third of its territory. Everything that we know today, California, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, etc. And yet Americans, unless you go to college and take a course on Latin American history, you'll never learn that was part. I mean, it's just like gloss over it. It was like we just kept expanding, and we brought civilization and these other places. So you have that there, and for many Mexicans, what that means is that the border is kind of like this rather elusive, kind of more, vague kind of thing because there are families on both sides. Then what you have is, of course, we have had a very steady flow and still have of migration. But you have other long established communities from California in New Mexico that have been there for 500 years from the first Spaniards. You even have their own dialects and so on. And then in Texas, very interesting studies where the more established communities in Texas and how they differ from California, the new arrivals, and today the way immigration works, you've got communities in San Jose with a community in Oaxaca that just has a steady flow now for 2 generations, bringing the family and the cousin and the friend, and those networks exist. They always have. And so all this to say, there's a view from the U.S. very legalistic. The border, it's very rigid. From Mexico, it's just it's a hassle. You got to go through it, but and they don't call it. And even the word they use, it's like the other side, el otro lado. I'm going to the other side, kind of thing. And my family comes from northeastern Mexico, Tamaulipas, which is a border state and, deeply, deeply connected to Texas, right? So all my life I've seen that flow, and now it continues. There's a whole border culture, more in common, on both sides. If you live in El Paso, you have more in common with those people in Ciudad Juarez than you do, with someone from Minnesota or Vermont. So I think it's a fascinating world, and you know, um, while we have broken those barriers and integrated, we have 2 steps back now. We're building walls again, and we're trying to make it harder to get over. Mexicans are going to do it no matter what you do. Mexicans are going to build a wall because that's the one who shows up at the corner when you need a job done. So it's a fun thing to see. It never ends. The story just continues in new variations.
We'll have to cover it going forward because it's dynamic. Every time you look, there are changes. May I offer the future will bring surprises, both good and bad. Thank you so much, Carlos.
Very grateful a chance to kind of bring us up to speed on Mexico because it's been under the radar with so much other stuff happening. But grateful again to share some insights and discuss this with you.
Thank you so much to Carlos Juarez, who is Mexican, at least by family. Am I right?
My
And
family, my heart, and I will add, while I was there some 5 years ago, I actually got my dual citizenship. So I do have a passport that I can, you know, in a pinch, turn to. But and the funny thing is, all my life, I've always said, and I still do, that I'm so grateful for the political rights and liberties that my U.S. passport gives me. And then curiously, now it's like, shoot, if I want free speech, do I have to go now to Mexico? The problem with Mexico, it's all about the money. If you have the money, you can get anything and write the rules that you need, get out of jail free, etc. Not in the US. I think we still rely on rules and laws, and it's my preference. So while we are going through some tough times, I'm still more comfortable with my US political rights and liberties. Still not ready to give them up yet.
no, with the emphasis on the word yet.
Yet.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Global Connections, and we've been engaging on where does Mexico stand? Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Carlos.